So, you want to make your way through the life-changing video series that is Awakening from the Meaning Crisis by John Vervaeke. But you know it's over 50 episodes long. That is a lot of Mullah. And each episode is quite difficult to understand because of the complex language. In this video, I'm going to give you a primer for Awakening from the Meaning Crisis so that you can enter into it without wanting to die. It's a truly life-changing series. My meaning in life has increased significantly after watching it, and I hope that after watching this primer and this series yourself, your meaning that you get from yourself, others, and the world can also increase. So let's start with the thesis of the series. Why are we experiencing a meaning crisis? John Vervaeke believes it's because we're falling short of three aspects that create meaning in our lives. Firstly, coherence, which is how much we feel the life we're living makes sense to us. The world makes sense. Mattering, which is how much we feel that we have significance beyond ourselves. And purpose, which is how much we feel that there is a deeper reasoning or meaning behind why we do the things that we do. So when we look at how we're falling short at these three aspects, we need to realize we're looking predominantly at Western civilization, because while there's also a meaning crisis being experienced in the East, John Vervaeke focuses on the West for his series. So let's go through each of those three things and see how we're falling short of them in the West. Firstly, for coherence, we feel our lives are absurd. They make no sense. They aren't coherent to us. And this is what happens when you're in what John Vervaeke calls an agent-arena relationship that doesn't fit. The agent-arena relationship is the relationship that you have between your agent, which in this case is you as a being that can do things in the world, and the arena that that agent is acting in. So a good example of an agent-arena relationship that fits is a professional tennis player in a tennis tournament. The agent and the arena are in alignment, and therefore it doesn't feel absurd. It makes coherent sense. Nowadays, we feel a lot of our agent-arena relationships don't fit, right? And much of this has to do with the movement away from religion to a more secular worldview. Before the scientific revolution in the 1500s, most of people in the world created coherence out of their lives through religion, because there were so many things that you couldn't explain. The only way you could explain them was through some sort of divine being. However, now that there's a huge movement away from religion, a lot of people don't have the coherence that religion gave them anymore, and therefore they feel their lives are absurd. This leads us into how we're falling short of mattering. And one of the reasons for that is going back to how scientific thought has promoted a movement of secular meaninglessness. This is coalesced through us prioritizing what John Vervaeke calls propositional and procedural knowing over perspectival and participatory. We're going to go more into what those are later, but for now, all you need to know is because of our scientific worldview, we prioritize, when we think of success, people that have a lot of knowledge, a lot of good, a lot of skills for how to do things. And that is encapsulated in perspectival and procedural knowing, which often is equated with ability to make money. That's what people see as success in our society. And we diminish the very important perspectival and participatory that have more to do with wisdom and rationality, which we'll dive into later as well. But ironically are much more conducive of creating a meaningful life. Next, we don't practice spirituality in the West. Rather, we practice spiritual materialism. Spiritual materialism is when we turn spiritual practices into ego-building exercises. So a good example is yoga and meditation. These are meant to be used to, in a part, connect you with the universe as a whole. That's what spirituality is, to deepen your insight into overcoming self-deception. However, in the West, we often use them as increasing focus, or for getting more flexible, or for as an exercise for physical fitness. Now, those are perfectly great reasons to do them as well, but if those are the predominant reasons rather than the spiritual aspect, you lose the spiritual touch these practices are meant to give, and therefore the mattering that you get from feeling connected to something greater than yourself. Next, Western individualism creates a culture of loneliness from ourselves, others, and the universe. And this is because Western society generally promotes individualistic notions of being a part of the world, whereas Eastern societies tend to vote collectivistic notions. The problem with individualism is that it isolates you from other people in the world. It feels like you lose out on the mattering that you might get from feeling connected to a greater whole. And this connection has become even harder to get now that there's digital technologies that have made finding genuine physical connections so much more difficult. So many people in my generation have no idea how to have a genuinely good physical conversation anymore. And also, these social medias have polarized our already polarized political climate. Democrats and Republicans really struggle to get along a lot of the time. And this makes it so that they're almost unwilling to interact with each other sometimes just because they have differing opinions. Further encapsulating this loss of mattering. And then finally, we've lost touch with agapic love, which is the type of love with the most wisdom contained inside of it, according to John Vervaeke. Agapic love is love of bringing something into being. And this is the type of love that parents have for their children, because they are bringing them into being at the sacrifice of themselves, right? When you become a parent, you have to forget all those travel plans that you might have had to go to the Caribbean or to wherever with your significant other. And instead you raise these two little hobgoblins or whatever amount of kids you have. And that's a profound form of love, which we've lost touch with in present day society, because agapic love actually can carry over into your love for outside of children and parent, right? You can have agapic love to help a friend succeed in their goals, even surpass you in some ways. But because people are so egotistical, they're not willing to have agapic love for other people as much as they could, because they don't even love themselves enough. They're too insecure to allow someone else to overcome them in some way. And then finally, we have purpose, which is also being neglected by a few things. Firstly, we're confusing our having needs with our being needs. In the series, having needs and being needs are proposed by Erich Fromm. And having needs are things we need to have in order to survive. Food, water, shelter, peanut butter. Just joking. You probably don't need that to survive. I might. But these are things you need to have. Being needs are things that you need to become in order to feel meaning. So I need to become mature. I need to become someone that loves music, classical music. I need to become wise. The problem is, in Western society, we confuse these two. A good example is a car commercial for a Porsche, let's say. A lot of commercials will try and persuade you that by having something like a car, a Porsche, you can become something. Like in a lot of car commercials, if someone that has a Porsche is depicted as super cool, they have a leather jacket and sunglasses and cool clothes other than that. And this is a problem because you can't fulfill your being needs by having something. This is just not possible. They might be able to help you, but by mistaking the two, you miss out on the meaning that comes with your being needs. This carries over into a second point, which is we prioritize resume virtues over eulogy ones. And this is a key differentiation described in The Road to Character. Resume virtues are virtues that you can put on your resume. Like, oh, you can use Photoshop. Oh, you have a 4.0 GPA. Oh, you know how to record using a camera. Eulogy virtues are more character driven. You're humble, you're gracious, you're kind, stuff like that. And we 100% prioritize resume virtues over eulogy ones because even at Cornell, where I'm right now, everyone's always talking about schoolwork, how much work they have, their GPA. There's rarely conversation, if ever, about character. Nobody talks about that. Like, oh, what did you do to become more gracious this week? That's just not a thing that people talk about, which is sad because it's so important for having purpose in one's life. So this 2 points lead into a third thing making purpose hard to find, which is we are stagnating in the growth of our character, despite the fact that it is fundamental to us as human beings. We crave growth. Think about how aversive it is to meet an old friend after a summer and hear, after you ask them the question, how was your summer? I didn't really do anything. Like that's just not fun to hear. It's not meaningful to us to feel like we've stagnated. Stagnation is death. And despite this fact, so many people don't actively work towards growing their character, even though it's fundamental to us as human beings. So because we confuse our having needs with our being needs, we prioritize resume virtues over eulogy ones, we're stagnating in the growth of our character. Next, our goals aren't our own because they are socialized into us. Socialization is the process by which you come to certain beliefs, goals, feelings, thoughts, behaviors because of your family, friends, society, culture, institutions that you grow up around. And without conscious awareness, your goals, as well as your thoughts, beliefs, feelings, whatever, might not be your own. They might be someone else's. And of course, if you don't feel like they are your own, you're going to feel a lack of purpose. Because it's like, well, I didn't choose these. Like, why do I want to become a doctor? Is it because I really want to become a doctor? Or is it because my parents and society told me to become a doctor? Right? So many people don't realize that how much socialization has impacted them, and it's leading them to feel a lack of purpose. And lastly, for why we're experiencing meaning crisis, there's more reasons other than this, but these are the main ones, is we don't experience flow nearly as often as we used to. The flow state is a state in which all other worldly matters seem to dissipate as we become completely immersed in the present. And because our culture has gotten so addicted to video games and social medias and attention-grabbing stuff, we don't have the mental capacities to focus on something long enough to get us into flow a lot of the time. Which is horrible because flow is one of the most purposeful feeling and meaningful feelings that you can have, right? The flow state is incredibly satisfying. I'm in the flow state right now as I'm recording this video, and it feels great, right? But because of what I said earlier, not as many people are getting to flow as they would like. So, what is John Vervaeke's solution? John Vervaeke sees the problem that we have with meaning making in our secular present day society, but he doesn't believe that we should get rid of religion for our meaning making, because religions have been an essential part of our meaning making in the past, and even now for creating meaning. But telling those that are religious to leave their religious practices that are indispensable to them for meaning making is not the solution, right? Christians have learned to have the Bible as their meaning making device, and you can't simply tell them to all become secular or all convert to Muslim, because they wouldn't be able to use those practices for meaning making. Some might, but for a lot, those practices are indispensable. The reason that that John Vervaeke doesn't want to push for a return back to religion, however, as we were before the scientific revolution, is that religions can create rigid thinking in their members. And this is largely because, as is abundantly obvious, all religions are not logical or reasonable. Most of them have some degree of faith that requires you to simply say, oh, yep, that's the truth. And this is not good for for discourse in society and coming up with new ideas and innovating, because it's a type of closed-mindedness. In the past, this closed-mindedness has led to horrific acts of genocide and oppression, like the Crusades and more. So what John Vervaeke proposes instead is we need a secular ecology of practices that we can ingrain that will help us create meaning out of our lives in the absence of religion. A secular worldview that will allow us to create meaning without creating closed-mindedness in its members. And this sets John Vervaeke on an epic adventure through the history of meaning making, how we create meaning out of our lives, and ultimately how we can secularly create meaning out of our lives. He uses cognitive science, which is a mix of linguistics, psychology, neuroscience, computer science, and philosophy, to use as a lens through which he does this, because he understands any one of the sciences isn't enough to fully understand our meaning-making abilities. You need all of them. And ultimately, John Vervaeke believes we can awaken from the meaning crisis by creating a worldview that incorporates all of the machinery for cultivating wisdom and rationality to overcome self-deception and create meaning in one and other's life. And it's a totally non-secular worldview of overcoming the meaning crisis, but at the same time isn't hostile towards religion as well. It's respectful. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to prime you for some of the answers to those questions that I just raised. How, firstly, does John explain that we create meaning out of our lives? Which will then allow us to create the question, how can we create a secular worldview of creating meaning? So John believes we create meaning out of our lives through the 4P3R model of cognition. This model of cognition states there's 4 different types of knowing and 3 cognitive features to those types. And those 4 types are participatory knowing, perspectival knowing, procedural knowing, and propositional knowing. So participatory knowing is the most fundamental type of knowing. According to John Vervaeke, it's not about knowing how to do things, but how to be in a certain context. So this form of knowing is preconceptual and not describable because it has to do with the fit between our agent-arena relationship, as mentioned before. It's about the attunement of the individual to their surroundings, which enables a flow state as opposed to confusion. So a good example is if you were playing The Witcher 3, which I love, participatory knowing would be the immersion of yourself in the Witcher universe, the identification of yourself as Geralt, other characters, and the Witcher universe, and the affordances that those relationships give you. That's participatory knowing. Perspectival knowing refers to the subjective viewpoint from which you view the world. It's a context-dependent knowing because it changes based on your environment, the people you're with, and what's happening around you, as well as how you fit into that scenario. So in The Witcher 3, perspectival knowing would be your understanding of your position in space and time within the Witcher world, as well as what's happening around you. Then we have procedural knowing, which is knowing about how to do things. It involves skills and procedures and is often tacit, meaning it can be hard to explain verbally until you consciously think about it. But it's evident through action. It ranges from simple tasks like tying shoelaces to complex ones like performing surgery. So in the previous Witcher 3 example, this would be your skills at using the combat system, at killing vast amounts of bandits, and setting up routines of quick saving before leaving the game so you don't lose all of your progress. I definitely did not learn that the hard way. And then finally, propositional knowing, which is knowing about facts and truth. It's expressed in declarative sentences and involves assertions that can be true or false. It's the kind of knowing that can be easily communicated and argued about. So in the previous video game example, it would be knowing the mechanics of the game, a specific item that gives you health, and how to defeat a certain boss. So those are the 4 types of knowing. And the 3 cognitive features of those types are relevance, realization, and recursive. So relevance refers to the importance of or salience of something within an environment or context. It's about what matters to an agent in a given environment. Cognitive systems have to filter through a lot of information, and relevance helps in modeling the situation to anticipate future states, right? If you took in all the information that came to you rather than only what was relevant, you would be overwhelmed. You wouldn't act. Realization carries a dual meaning because it bridges between perception and action. To realize is both comprehend, to see, to grasp, and bring into meaning, to make or construct. So in cognitive terms, when one realizes relevance, they both understand what is important and are able to take the necessary steps to act upon it, moving closer to a goal. And finally, this process is recursive because there are feedback loops intrinsic to it. Recursive processes allow for constant updating and refining of models and behaviors based on feedback from both internal states and the external environment. So it's about the dynamic interplay between the agent and their arena, where each informs and shapes each other interdependently. You can't separate them. And this 3R part of this model that I just described is what John calls relevance realization. Now, this is crucial to understand. This is foundational to his secular theory of meaning making. In simple terms, relevance realization is the process through which organisms realize relevance in their environment. And in this definition, realized is used both in definitions of the word, to become aware of and to create or cause something to happen. So a great metaphor for relevance realization is a chess match. In a chess match, you have a seemingly infinite number of moves that you could move your chess pieces in. But it would be completely idiotic to think about every single one of those moves that you could do when you're making a move. It would cause what John Vervaeke calls combinatorial explosion, where there'd be so many decisions that you could make that you end up not making a single one because it's too overwhelming. So what you should instead do is realize what decisions are relevant to that game? Which decision is likely to lead to a checkmate in the end? And that's what helps stop combinatorial explosion. This same logic can be taken outside of chess. You are constantly confronted with more information than you can handle, and some important, some not. The process through which you determine what is relevant and realize what to do with that information is relevance realization. So some examples to understand it more concretely are grocery shopping. When you're grocery shopping, you're bombarded with so many choices. You have to find relevant stuff. In my case, that's finding the healthy vegetables and meats. In your case, it might be finding the very unhealthy processed chocolate foods, which I admit I also do sometimes, not all the time, but we might have different relevance. Next, driving in traffic. When we're driving, we're constructed with all of these other pieces of information, like other drivers, stoplights, pedestrians, but we only notice what's relevant. Like when the stop sign is red, we process that and we're like, whoa, better stop, right? You don't notice the clouds when you're driving as much unless you focus on them. And then in social interactions, in conversations, you constantly pick up on cues to determine what topics are of interest or importance to others. So you can focus on certain aspects of the discussion while ignoring others and trying to maintain meaningful and appropriate interactions, hopefully. So why do we do relevance realization? It's because we're both embodied and embedded. Embodied means that the mind sits inside of a body, which alters how it behaves. And our mind changes due to the fact that it's enmeshed inside of a body. It's also embedded in that it's inside of an environment, right? We exist in a earth, and because we exist in this environment rather than another planet, that alters how we realize relevance. So these two things combine to make us organisms constantly in the process of optimizing between efficiency and resiliency to adapt to our environment, survive, and replicate our genes. Organisms that can realize relevance most effectively are going to be most apt to doing this. So this is why you can only understand evolution in the context of an environment, as well as relevance realization in the context of an environment and the organism. And this goes completely against the metaphor that we've long had for the brain and cognition, which is a computer metaphor. Like, oh, the mind is a computer that inputs information and never forgets it and works the same way in every place. Completely false, right? Think about it like this. A shark is only adaptive in the environment it's evolved for, but put it in a desert and it dies in minutes. So clearly the shark's relevance realization is different from that of a cactus. Well, cactus probably not a good example. It's different from that of a hamster. And this is John's secular, naturalistic explanation for how we create meaning out of our lives. In summary, relevance realization acts as a dynamic, adaptive process that guides us into navigating these four kinds of knowing. And we continually interact with a complex and changing environment, selecting and focusing on what is pertinent and valuable. And this ongoing process helps us to develop and maintain a coherent sense of our agent-arena relationship, going back to the 3 parts of mattering. It helps us understand the subjective viewpoint from which one and others perceive the world, going back to perspectival knowing. It helps us acquire and apply skills effectively in various situations, going to procedural knowing. And it helps us form and refine our propositional understanding of our world, going to propositional knowing. And through this integration, we create a sense of meaning of our lives. We create coherence, we create mattering, we create purpose. And through adjusting our processes of relevance realization, we can alter how well we create meaning out of our lives. So, how do we optimize the integration between the 4Ps and relevance realization to find meaning in our lives? That is the golden question. That's the question John poses as the foundation for the series. And the problem is that most people's relevance realization machinery is not optimized to finding meaning in life. So for example, if someone struggles with relevance realization, they might find it difficult to discern what is unimportant versus what is important in a situation. They might be overwhelmed by choices, unable to decide what to focus on and act on. And without being able to prioritize and focus on what's truly important, life can feel chaotic and directionless. So John believes that answering this problem is in developing rationality and wisdom. So let's deal with rationality first. We've completely lost touch with what it means to be rational. And by losing touch with rationality, we've lost the cultural grammar that we need to overcome self-deception, create meaning, and practice virtue. In other words, we don't have the language for discussing meaning making. And this is part of the reason discussions over meaning making and wisdom are so rare in everyday society. As a result, it's rarely thought about by most people. To show my point, what comes to mind when you hear the word rationality? You likely think intelligence and logic. And you might see images of Spock or Spock from Star Trek. And this notion of rationality is completely counteractive to how rationality has been seen historically. Rationality to Aristotle and the ancient Greeks was the capacity one had for acting in a way that grows their character. Rationality had ties to virtue, to overcoming self-deception, to creating meaning, and ultimately to becoming wise. This is no longer the case. We need to bring back a new definition of rationality that will allow us to talk about the things mentioned above, as well as figure out how we build it. So my favorite definition comes from the series that John Vervaeke says, which is rationality is the capacity to reliably and systematically overcome self-deception. There are a few important aspects to this definition. Firstly, being rational means you consistently, reliably overcome self-deception. Not necessarily always, but reliably. Secondly, rationality is systemic, meaning it's not domain specific. And this is what differentiates it from expertise. Expertise is domain specific. A tennis expert isn't necessarily an expert in other areas of life. However, if you're rational, that carries over into all aspects of your life. In fact, being an expert in a domain might actually hurt you in other domains. Like being really good at tennis might hurt you when you play ping pong or squash because you try and bring that tennis procedural knowing into those sports which aren't apt to it. Thirdly, rationality is not the same as logic or intelligence, right? In fact, according to research cited by John Vervaeke in the series, intelligence only has a 0.3 correlation with what researchers operationalize as rationality. So they're just not the same thing. How many intelligent people do you know that aren't rational? They aren't good at making meaning. They aren't wise. There's quite a few. And then fourthly, rationality, unlike intelligence, is incredibly malleable. One who's not rational can become rational by aspiring to be more rational. And then fifth and finally, rationality is pre-inferential and inferential. Rational people are good at solving problems using evidence and reasoning consciously, but they also have an incredibly trained unconscious and subconscious for getting insights through self-deception. And you're probably thinking, that sounds phenomenal, Aiden. But how do you train your capacity for rationality? I'm glad you asked, because John mentions quite a few things that he dives into deeper in the series. Firstly, develop a need for cognition. a need, almost craving for cognition, formulating problems and solving them. Reason this is so important is because the more problems you formulate and solve, the better you'll become at using evidence and reasoning to solve problems. And also, the more you'll learn about yourself and therefore further your ability to overcome self-deception, right? Think about how antagonist this is to most people's conception of learning. We tend to equate learning with anxiety because of the school system that makes us hate it. But learning intrinsically is integral to developing the evidence and reasoning skills, the knowledge of the self, the insight capabilities to overcome self-deception, ultimately create meaning. Next, develop a growth mindset. The growth mindset is a mindset proposed by Carol Dweck, which states that intelligence is not fixed. And by solving problems, failing, you can increase your natural intelligence past what you were genetically endowed. The reason this mindset is so powerful is because it teaches you that failure is necessary for growth, and therefore you're not scared of failure. Whereas if you have a fixed mindset, you will actively avoid challenges that will grow you better because you don't want to expose your natural abilities. So developing a growth mindset is integral to becoming more rational. And it's important to note in that definition, I would actually argue stumbling across my word. Intelligence is actually rationality in the growth mindset view, because your core hard intelligence, which you might define as your capacity for working memory, is actually pretty fixed. Your rationality, however, is 100% malleable. Next, learn more about logic, probabilistic thinking, systems thinking, evolution, scientific thinking. These are all types of thinking that will profoundly increase your ability for rationality. And also types of thinking humans are not evolved to do, right? We grew in the we evolved for the African savanna. We didn't evolve to have logic, probabilistic thinking as high as would be helpful. So ingraining these things can help you overcome self-deception. Next, meditate. This is going to develop your capacity for insight and your self-knowledge. And the reason is meditation, which, as it's not often seen in Western society, is a practice that helps you focus on your frames, right? When you meditate, often you analyze what thoughts and feelings are characteristically coming up. And this helps you see how you frame the world. And once you see how you frame the world, you can choose to change how you frame it. Because you might realize, wow, the way I'm framing the world is really hurting my ability to get meaning in life, to feel happy. Think about it like a metaphor is you're constantly wearing glasses that are shaded, making you see the world differently. And when you meditate, you are taking off those glasses to question if that's really how you want to see the world. Next, contemplate. This will help you change your framing of the world to be less prone to self-deception. Contemplation is changing your frames, whereas meditation is focusing on them. So you can see how integral they are both to becoming more rational. Next, immerse yourself in a community of reasoners who spot each other's fallacies. And this is because we often spot other people's self-deceptions better than we do our own, right? Think about how good you are at giving advice to a friend. And then how bad you are often at giving that same advice to yourself. Whereas if you take an outside perspective, you immerse yourself in a community of reasoners, they can point out your bull crap to you, give you that outside perspective that's so valuable. Next, become radically open-minded. One of the problems with religion mentioned before is that it makes you closed-minded if you stick too hard to the beliefs. And this makes it hard to learn new things because you aren't willing to adventure into some territories. So by becoming radically open-minded, by solving many problems on a whole range of disciplines with your need for cognition, you can learn more about yourself once again, and also develop your evidence and reasoning skills to overcome self-deception. And then finally, differentiate your information diet. This will break you out of the echo chambers you've created for yourself. Our social media algorithms and even the information we get from other people, it's all information, can make us rigid in our thinking because they put us into echo chambers, closed systems of thought and ideas. And that can make it hard to break through and see deeper into reality, which, as we've seen, makes us not feel meaning in our lives. So I know that was a lot to take in, but philosophizing over rationality like this is essential. And writing this down myself and understanding it more deeply is what is involved in becoming rational, because it not only helps me to aspire to be more rational, but also gives us the grammar to talk about it with others. So this grammar is critical for addressing the meaning crisis, because when you have language to describe something, you can actually talk about it with other people instead of just making meaning something that you just pass off to the side and don't talk about, even though it's fundamental to life. So rationality is integrally tied to wisdom, which is what we're going to talk about now. And wisdom integrates rationality, but goes a step further. In simple terms, wisdom, according to John, is the aspiration and realizing of one's optimal integration between relevance realization and the 4 types of knowing to create meaning out of one's life and others, as well as overcoming self-deception. So it's like the meta meaning-making skill. And there's a couple things I want to dive into in that definition, which is, first, wisdom is more about the process than the outcome. It's fostered on the level of perspectival and participatory and procedural rather than just the propositional level. And because of this, it takes more than just knowledge of wisdom to be wise. Knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing, right? You can tell this by the fact that experts in a field that are very knowledgeable aren't always the most wise. Sometimes the most wise people are the ones that don't know that much. So it requires changing in participatory, perspectival, and procedural knowing. And this can be helped through propositional knowing, but ultimately isn't sufficient enough. And this is what makes it so hard to pass on wisdom compared to knowledge, because wisdom requires you often to change those first 3 levels of knowing, which means you have to experience something a lot of the time. You can't just get told about it, right? If you could change your life just by getting told about something, nobody would be obese. Nobody would lack meaning in their lives, because you could just read a book and you'd be like, wahoo, that's all I got to do, right? So clearly that's not enough. One aspect of wisdom is also determining what degree of virtues is relevant for any given context. And this is important because virtue is integral to finding meaning in one's life, feeling purposeful. The reason that this is true is that virtues are not one note. You can't just say you should be courageous, you should be honest in all circumstances, because the context determines how honest or how courageous it would be virtuous to be. Imagine if your wife came into the room on the day of your wedding day, or your husband, I don't know, and they were like, do I look fat in this dress? It's 2 minutes before you go out in the congregation. You don't want to spoil the mood. And because you're super honest, because you think it's so virtuous to be honest, you're like, yes, you are the fattest person I've ever seen you ever be in that dress. That's being a meanie. I didn't want to swear. That's being a meanie, right? That's a too high degree of honesty. That's not being virtuous. And this happens with all of the virtues. It is possible to be too honest, too courageous. That's called being rash or being a meanie in the honesty sense. And it's also possible to be too little. So wisdom is determining what degree of virtues is relevant for any given context. Notice the relevance realization. Ultimately, John believes, so summing this all up, once again, John believes we can awaken from the meaning crisis by creating a worldview that incorporates all of the machinery for cultivating wisdom and rationality to overcome self-deception and create meaning in one and other's life, which is integrally related to optimizing your relevance realization machinery for cultivating wisdom and rationality. I know that was a lot. That it's a totally non-secular review of overcoming the meaning crisis, but it isn't hostile towards religion at the same time. It's respectful. So now that I've summarized the main argument of John in the 50-episode series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, I wanted to go over 6 lessons that I learned from Awakening from the Meaning Crisis for creating meaning in my life as a conclusion to this video. These are just the 6 most important things I think I took away from the series, because I don't think you have to know everything he says. If you take away some of the principles of what he says, it's profound in itself. So what are those 6 lessons? Firstly, relate beyond propositional knowing. As said earlier, in Western society, we tend to promote propositional knowing above and procedural knowing above the other 2 types. We equate success with money and ability to do things like skills, competence. And that's a problem because perspectival and participatory knowing are integral to our meaning making. Second thing I learned is to cut through the self-deception. Human beings are incredibly self-deceptive by nature. In fact, it has caused so many people to actually call us rationalizing creatures rather than rational, because we often use our reasoning and logic abilities to rationalize why we do something stupid rather than for doing something smart. So to cut through the self-deception, we need to do everything I mentioned before about cultivating rationality, which is exactly what rationality is, cutting through self-deception. Thirdly, don't go at it alone. You don't have to pursue this whole meaning-making endeavor on your own. In fact, you shouldn't, because being immersed in a community of people that can spot your bullcrap will help you in not falling for some of this idiocy. That you can often give advice to your friends better than you can give advice to yourself. Next, learn how to get into flow more often. Getting into flow is an incredibly meaningful experience, and we've lost touch with it because we're so bad at focusing attention. If you want to learn how to get into flow more often, you should check out my 2-part series on how to get into flow, because this is going to help you create more meaning out of your life. And fifthly, see how you see. As I said earlier, we look at the world through our frames without realizing it. We have tinted eyeglasses on. And only by meditating and contemplating, meditation for focusing on frames and contemplating for focusing on changing them, can we transframe, change the way that we frame the world to be more apt to meaning making and wisdom. And then 6, and finally, see life as your practice. Life itself is the arena in which you can learn how to cultivate rationality and wisdom. And the reason I think this is such a good lesson to end on is it creates a zest for life. So many people are nihilistic, and in our generation, in my generation nowadays, and also just in the West in general. And I think if they saw life more as the battleground for cultivating rationality, wisdom, and meaning, that zest for life would start to come back, that passion, that love, that like, wow, I'm alive right now. It's sick. That's insane. Would come back. So that was my primer of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I highly encourage you, if this intrigued you, and if you made it this far, definitely, to adventure into the series yourself, the 50 episode series. It's a lot of Mullah. I think watching this video will help you in understanding the series better once you go in, instead of being slapped in the face like I was. So, as always, have a fantastic rest of your day. Eat some peanut butter, and bye-bye.